Hi, my name is Greg Canty, and I'd like to welcome you to the Win Happy podcast. I love chatting to people from all walks of life about their lives and their careers, about the choices they make along the way to pursue their happiness, and what winning actually means to them. I hope you enjoy these conversations as much as I do. Thanks for listening. Early in the morning on the 13th of June 2025, the air raid sirens and the phone alerts came, and you had to move to a communal centre with your partner and your 2 children. What thoughts go through your head when you hear the bombs overhead? What conversations do you have with other people that are sheltering? What do you tell your children? Does it make people think about what it must be like for people in Gaza as the bombs rain down on them and they have no shelters? How do you do this day after day when those sirens alert you once again to take cover? Now that the war with Iran is over, how do you feel? What is the position with Gaza, and has this changed the standing of Netanyahu? On today's podcast, I chat with Paul Kearns, urban planner, author and journalist, about his experience living in Tel Aviv with his young family for the last 8 years, and wonder, quite frankly, what is he still doing there? Let's hear from Paul. Paul Kearns, a huge welcome back to the Win Happy podcast. When I asked the question, how are you doing? It's kind of like a bigger question when I ask you than when I would ask most people, because it's quite relevant and it's a huge question. So how are you doing?
Well, first of all, thanks, Greg. I'm happy to be back. I'm doing okay. It's very hard to be the judge of how one is doing, but I think I'm doing okay. Yeah. You sense when the ceasefire went into place not so long ago, you do switch into a different gear. It has meaning to your body and your mind.
I'm sitting in a cloud in West Cork, in Crookhaven, on a Sunday. What do we do for the day? If it clears up a bit, walk on the beach, whatever. I don't have to worry about bombs coming down on top of us. You're in Tel Aviv. The last time we spoke, end of March, episode 331, you were giving us an update on the perspective from within Israel on everything Gaza and everything Israel post October 7th, 2023. And little did I think that it would be such an upside down time for you. The last thing I asked you when we spoke, and we might revisit this question at the end of this podcast, and it was a very genuine question. It was me asking you, what in the name of God are you doing living in that place? So, and you did give me an answer. So I might ask you again at the end of this episode. I'm not sure if your answer will be the same or if it will be any different. As a point of interest, a very unusual thing, it's the first time I've learned that. I assumed being a Sunday, despite the circumstances, it's a rest day, but it's different in Israel, you were telling me.
Yeah, Sunday is Yom Rishon, which literally means the first day of the week. So Sunday is the first day of the working week for Israel, for Judaism, for Jews. So they work Sunday to Thursday, and most people are off Friday and then Saturday. But the kids go to school on Friday morning, so they go to school 6 mornings a week. But yeah, this is the first day of the week. So it's
But despite that, you went for a swim first thing.
I went for a swim. The sun is shining. The sun is always shining, I'm afraid, in Israel, almost. So I went for a swim, notwithstanding everything that's happening around you, not far away from you. You take your moments with the ceasefire having come into effect. You switch back to as much as possible as you can to what you think is a normal life, or how to, live out a normal life. And so I went for a swim in the sea.
Yeah.
Magical.
So before the 13th of June, when war broke out, that relationship with Iran, in an Irish context, I think a lot of people wouldn't be clear at all about what that is like. Could you describe that to me and the background and what would be in the heads of Israelis and Paul Kearns as you go about your life in Tel Aviv?
Well, the backdrop of Iran is always there. It's been a lifetime mission or ambition of Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu to ensure that Iran doesn't have a nuclear bomb. And I'm sure many Irish people or people around the world have seen the videos of him warning against that year after year, decade after decade. So there's always an expectation or a belief that something big might happen with Iran. And last year we did have a moment, I guess, where missiles came in, but the view of that it was telegraphed or in advance to prevent serious damage here and in Iran. So it was a very different affair. So on the night of the Thursday night, Friday morning, I woke up around 3:00 in the morning to the sounds of an alarm. This is the deafening alarm that hits all across Israel when there's a threat of a missile. I thought it was just another Houthi missile. When I say that, that's life. You get used to a Houthi missile from Yemen every week. So most of those are shot down, or nearly all are shot down. Although one did hit the airport a month or two back. And so I didn't pay much attention. I just thought, okay, that's just another Houthi missile. But then strange sound came from the phone, which was very different. I hadn't heard before. And I looked at the phone and it said, extreme emergency, go to shelters. This was in Hebrew and in English. And then we looked at the news and looked up, what was happening on the news on the internet, and immediately found out that Israel had attacked Iran and that there was a likelihood of cruise missiles coming in from Iran soon. That, in effect, was the way the Israeli state or the government had decided to inform the Israeli people who were at war, to wake them up at 3 a.m. Obviously, the timing is for military reasons, etc., but that's how we found out. And then things changed quite dramatically after that. There was sirens for most of the day, and there was genuine fear that something big was imminent. And so for the next couple of days, you're running from shelters, communal shelters from your home. We eventually moved east of the city to stay with the kid's grandmother, who has a mamad. The story has kind of hit it Irish. There's an awareness in Ireland now that Israelis have what's called mamad, which is a war room in new buildings. And in the centre of Tel Aviv, most apartments are old, and they don't, so they have communal shelters. So, yeah, and we had one night of a communal shelter experience where the kids was late and the phone goes off again, and then we were running onto the street to go. It's about 4-minute walk, and you're halfway there with a 2-year-old and an 8-year-old, and the siren hits, and there's dozens of people running towards the shelter, and I lost sight momentarily of the 8-year-old. She got in, and then you're underground with hundreds of others. These are big shelters with dogs. It's strange. The dogs are permitted to go in, so there's dozens of dogs. Tel Aviv likes their dogs, so there's a strange atmosphere. The dogs are going crazy. There's babies. And then the booms start, and that night there was a lot of damage. So tremendous explosions, even though you're underground. And it's surreal. It's genuinely very surreal.
Were people rushing towards the shelters, or people racing, or is this all very, okay, let's walk in an orderly way, let's not be all panicked? Are people just buzzing past each other?
It's a good question. I noticed there was a change of pace as the week or the 10 days went on. I think at the very beginning, there was more panic. But as the whole time frame of the sequence of alarms you get familiar with, first the sound on your phone, and then it could be at least 10 minutes before you have the huge siren that comes across the entire city, the bomb siren. And then you might have another 5 minutes before rockets hit and the booms. So as people became, quote unquote, used to the fact that missiles were coming in, they probably weren't very far from, certainly with their kids, from shelters. So they, arranged their life in such a way that you wouldn't be caught out. And so there was a visibly calmer, I wouldn't say order, but I was watching from the roof of the balcony, and there was, kids are playing, and then the alarm goes off on the phone, and the kids walk reasonably fast, but there's no utter panic. They supposedly have that 15 minutes to get into a bomb shelter.
In terms of the amount of time you spend in the shelter, how do you know that it's okay to come out? Is there another sequence of notifications on phones and all that kind of thing?
There is, yeah. The government or the system notifies you that it's safe to leave. obviously the sound of the booms in the sky or the interceptions or hits, depending where you are, when it goes silent, gives you some clue. But there is a notification that's sent, and in my experience, everybody abides by that. The risk, otherwise is just too great. I mean, one of the worst nights was a tower not far from us was hit. So the booms are very deafening. They're very loud, even if they might be a kilometre away or 2 kilometres away. But this hit a building, and actually on that night, 4 people, this is in Petah Tikva, suburb east of Tel Aviv, were killed. But the entire, and this is a new apartment block, solid, the entire room shook, and the walls are reinforced concrete. The window has a huge, thick metal frame that you slide over that's hard to close and open to protect. The whole thing just rattled and shook. I never forget that the 2-year-old asked me, "Who's knocking, Daddy? Who's knocking? Who's knocking?" So her thoughts or imagination was that somebody was banging at the door. Obviously, she had no clue why we were going into the room, but she was used to the routine. But I remember when she said, "Who's knocking? Who's knocking?" The 8-year-old obviously knew what was happening and tried to, shield the imagery of the devastation of the site's hit from her.
And how were you feeling in the middle of all that, Paul?
Utterly surreal. I mean, your first priority is the kids. And you're thinking many, many, many thoughts, you're thinking the worst. You're thinking, when I come out of the shelter, what will the damage be? Where will it be? And everybody's thinking that. It's a lottery from the sky. And, I'm sure many people are thinking that in Gaza, it's 1,000 times worse every night for 2 years. Of course it is. And they don't have bomb shelters and dozens are dying every night. But you're sitting there kind of making these weird statistical calculations in your head that you have to be damned unlucky to be hit. But it could be you, because there's no rhyme or reason as to where. And we stayed either in Tel Aviv or the eastern suburbs, so it's high density, so they were targets. And our home in Tel Aviv, within a kilometre or 2 in each direction, there was direct hits. And the deaths there were quite low. Oddly, the deaths were quite low, was I think because the buildings were old, even though the devastation was wide. And therefore, most people went underground into the really reinforced communal shelters. Where the deaths were high, ironically, without going into the weeds here, were in the newer buildings where people were in their own private shelter. A direct hit on the building just wouldn't, the building stood, but the room didn't survive. And that's where most people were killed. So you're actually safer underground. But the people who made the choice to stay in the city to go underground, you might be woken 3 or 4 times a night to do that, or you might just stay there all night long with the kids on a mattress with hundreds of others.
And the conversations underground with people, are people interacting?
They are. The main conversations is, does anybody have information where there's a hit or news information? It's a strange atmosphere. People are tense but trying to remain calm with children. Where there's a bit of kind of frisson or kind of agitation, it was strangely around the presence of the dogs.
Oh my God. Who brought a dog in here?
Well, I think about 30% of the people have the dogs. So I couldn't believe. Now, there's 2 people in the world, 2 types of people in the world: people who love dogs and people who don't. So, Israelis love or Tel Avivians love their dogs. So the dogs were there, but many people found that very stressful with young children because the dogs were stressed. It just booms, bangs, and they were underground with a load of other dogs. So there was a febrile atmosphere that the dogs weren't helping. So there was some tension around the dogs, but in general, I think most people were just quiet and, there was a deep level of shock in Israel at the level of destruction where the missiles hit. Now, they only hit how many, maybe 25, 30 direct hits, and maybe half of those in high dense urban areas. So the level of destruction, that's all you're talking about. But it was a couple of blocks and many, many buildings and damage to dozens of buildings. There was a shock at that. Israelis have never experienced that before in recent history. And again, I'm sure people are thinking, well, have they seen? They must see and know about the utter destruction of Gaza, where reports say 60% of all buildings have been destroyed. I guess they have, but until it's happening to them, it's just a different experience.
That's a very logical conversation to have. What must it be like for the people in Gaza? Was that uttered by anyone in those shelters?
No, not that I heard, and I couldn't say that that didn't take place. In the 12 days of the war, I did not have one conversation with one Israeli where they prompted the conversation by saying, this must be what it feels like in Gaza and a lot worse. That conversation may have happened. I didn't hear it. Certainly wasn't on the news. You know, it's difficult for me to say this, but it's true. I had many people say to me, I felt like sitting duck, or, you know, all sorts of variations of. And the first thing that comes into your mind is like, what do you think they might feel like in Gaza? But for, I don't know how to phrase this, but that type of conversation pops up where people are expressing, you know, the reality of what happened and their fear. If you were to jump in and say, well, what about Gaza? You would be straining your relations with every single person around you. And you feel there's never the appropriate moment. At the end of the school year, we were going to see a kind of a school event with the 8-year-old, and parents are saying this to me. Just a normal conversation, you know, describing their feelings and their experience. And no one would dream of talking about Gaza. And, you know, I would be perceived as being everything from virtue signaling to just pissing people off. If I said, what do you think about Gaza? Maybe your closest friends and your partner, etc., would have those conversations.
And is that a case of people just don't have that thought, or they probably do have the thought, but you just can't say that out loud when you're living in Israel?
You know, that's a very extraordinary, interesting question to ask. And I think about that a lot, and I don't have the answer to that. I do not think many, I won't say most, but many Israelis are thinking or have thought about their experience over these 12 days and what it must be like in Gaza. It's hard to imagine in their privacy of their own mind, they may have those thoughts, but I just don't sense a connection. It's extraordinary for me to say that, but I don't. And maybe the best judgment of that is the news. The news for the 12 days, destruction in Gaza for the most part of the last 20 months of war is, I wouldn't say it's peripheral, but it's not the main news about the war. It's the hostages, it's the wider politics, it's the death of soldiers. There's obviously stories about Gaza, but the level of destruction, the harrowing images, I said this before, the harrowing images that Irish people see in the news of a parent, you know, with a dead child over their arms, or more graphic imagery, it's not shown. So Gaza vanished. And I was writing some articles for the newspapers, and you would never know from the news that over the 12 days of war that 700 Palestinians were killed in Gaza. You wouldn't know at all. Now, I'm glued to the news. My Hebrew is not great, but I'm glued to the news to get the vibe and to see what they're talking about and where the explosions are and see the imagery. So for those 12 days, I did not see or hear one story about Gaza, at the level of deaths in Gaza. Haaretz, the main left of centre kind of paper of record, has great reporting and graphic reporting and great reporting in detail about the deaths in Gaza, including the amount of children. But on the main evening news, no. And yet I found what was very, very interesting is that the images of destruction in Tehran, they showed.
Okay.
And it wasn't a celebratory thing about, you know, the infrastructure being blown up. They showed the streets of Tehran where, you know, maybe a particular so-called surgical strike took out an apartment block, but there was a level of destruction on the streets. There was broken masonry, you know, broken trees, burnt out cars. The very imagery that you see on the news from Tel Aviv from the strikes, they were very similar in Tehran, and the Israeli news showed them really quickly. And that dramatic imagery of the lady reading the news, and they hit the TV station and she had to run off. They show that in Israel within, you know, minutes of that happening. So there's an extraordinary dichotomy between maybe empathy wasn't the word, but interest in the damage done in Tehran, in cities, versus the complete blanked out news about Gaza. And at one point, one of the news panelists had to say, oh, by the way, that's Tehran, that's not Tel Aviv, because some parts of Tehran, they just look like Tel Aviv, a mix of architectural styles, some kind of breeze block stuff from the 70s, some boring stuff from the 80s, almost the same cars. It's a quick look and you wouldn't know which was what, and because they were showing the images of both cities all the time. And I found that very interesting. So there's a sense that they were also interviewing a lot of people from Iran around the world who were claiming that many Iranians were welcoming the Israeli attack and they were hoping to overthrow the regime. So you got this bizarre feeling in Israel that Israel was doing people of Iran a favor. And
we're the good guys here.
We're the good guys. And Netanyahu stressed at the beginning, we're not at war with the people of Iran, we're at war with the regime. He mentioned actually in the night of the attack, Cyrus the Great. Now, I'm sure many people don't know who Cyrus the Great is, but he's a figure in historical Persian culture. And so there is in Judaism, but also in Israeli historical narrative, a strong connection between the Jewish people of the Levant here, this part of the world, and the people of Persia. And it's an interesting perspective that fed into that we're not against the people of Iran, we're against the regime.
I was doing a little bit of research, and that whole conversation about Iran developing nuclear weapons, I could see that going back as far as 2002. So that's a narrative that's existed for quite a long time. And you had 2015 with that accord that I think Obama negotiated. Then 2018, you had, of course, Trump being quite determined to tear up anything that Obama did, from Obamacare to agreements about climate change, agreements with Iran. A bizarre tearing up of that agreement. And now in the middle of everything that's happening in Gaza, do you understand why that strike happened, why Netanyahu and his government decided to start shooting at Iran on Friday the 13th of June? When I heard it, I'm just thinking, what the hell are you doing? Are you not in enough shit as it is without drawing this upon you right at this moment? That was my thoughts. I thought, this is just bizarre. This is the last thing on this earth that is needed right now. What were your thoughts? And what were the thoughts from within inside Israel about the timing of it?
Well, the big picture, which is a belief in Israel for decades, that Iran can't possibly get a nuclear bomb because it's an existential threat to Israel. And there's the language around the regime in Iran, which is very explicit. I mean, Ayatollah Khamenei, he said, I think about 12 years ago, that Israel was a cancerous tumor that had to be removed from the region. So the language of genocide or destruction, is real. And the other side or the other part of that picture is Iran, I guess, through its proxies, whether it's rockets from Houthi in Yemen or Hezbollah. I mean, there's no real border dispute between Lebanon and Israel. It's Hezbollah. The terrorism, the attacks that surround Israel, there's a recognition that Iran, and by everybody, I guess, internationally, is behind those. There's a deep kind of belief, or has been a deep belief in Israel, that a big war with Iran was inevitable to take out, if we're to believe, the success of its military nuclear infrastructure. The timing was the only thing maybe up for debate as to why. People might have expected the attack to be happening in 2 years, 4 years, 1 year, and then there was chatter. I think everybody saw that on the news that week from the Wall Street Journal that an attack was imminent, and there was an expectation that it would be on the Monday. And my own personal belief was, it's Thursday night, Friday. They're not going to attack on the Shabbat. It's too complicated for loads of reasons. It's going to happen Sunday night, which was the last time. So I had an expectation on Sunday night. Now, why Netanyahu decided to do it, there's lots of speculation. The whole discussion about him preempting the final round of talks, I think that's all pure speculation. And there was talks to be going on for decades with Iran, and who knows who's duping whom, etc. What was interesting from my perspective was that very week, Netanyahu was in court on the Monday or Tuesday for the first time in his own defense case for corruption. That Thursday, there was a vote of no confidence in the government because there was a belief from the opposition that some of the religious parties would vote for a particular subject around who goes into the army if you're religious Haredim are not obligated to go into the army. So there was a backdrop that he was under pressure. Obviously, we would all have to assume that the military strategy around the whole attack was planned for months, if not years, and constantly updated. But why to press the button on the night of the 12th or the morning of the Friday the 13th? I think ultimately no one will ever know that day, rather than a week later, a month later, or a year later.
So your friends and neighbours and all of these other citizens of Tel Aviv, when you're with them in these shelters, are they given out about Netanyahu at this point in time? Like, are you blaming him, or is this nothing whatsoever to do with him? What's the conversation?
It's mixed. His popularity hasn't risen. There was maybe an expectation. I actually expected his popularity to surge because if there was a general belief in Israel and abroad that this was successful, he has achieved, a strategic goal of Israel for decades to take out Iran's military infrastructure, nuclear infrastructure. But no, the government remains unpopular, and he didn't get a surge in popularity. There was and there is huge support for the attack. There was opinion polls taken very quickly. Some 75% of the population supported the attack. About 17%, if I recall, were against it, and the remainder didn't know. There was also a substantial minority, I think it was up to 30%, who believe the timing of the attack was purely motivated by Netanyahu's political self-interest. So there's a robust debate in Israel about Netanyahu, and it remains unpopular. So, to sum it up, the attack was supported, but it didn't rebound positively on him personally in terms of, his opinion poll ratings, and there was some suspicion about the timing. I think also there wasn't an expectation of the level of destruction every time a missile hit, and that the capacity for Israelis to continue under that level of bombardment night after night for like 6 weeks or 2 months was just not going to. So it was just not going to happen. So I wasn't surprised by how quick it ended, because I thought it was in everybody's self-evident interest, the regime in Iran for survival and for Netanyahu to declare success. Because I think the popularity, even though it's low, of him and the government wouldn't win an election tomorrow morning, it would have, I think, fallen quite quickly, if people were subject to that level of stress and bombardment.
And Donald Trump then putting his big boots into the whole thing and authorising the dropping of those big bombs. That did bring it to an end, didn't it?
Well, I think it did. So there's some irony there, I suppose, for political observers when America did get involved, and the initial reaction globally was understandably huge fear that there's going to be a wider regional war, that the Gulf states are going to be involved, the price of oil is going to rocket, and who knows what else. But oddly, it had the opposite effect, and it gave both the regime in Iran and the government in Israel, maybe excuse is not the right word, but a reason to stop. Because Netanyahu was declaring a victory. It was important for him to do that. And the regime, obviously, his priorities at that point were survival. What damage was done, to what extent the nuclear program is set back, the kid on the street probably has as good interpretation of that as everybody. Nobody really knows, and it'll be impossible probably for anybody to ever really know, especially if inspectors are not allowed in. So The discussion around that is just speculation, but I think politically motivated from every side to continue the war, to declare that it was a failure, to declare it a success.
Do you consider it to have been a war?
Yes. When you're living under 12 days of
Yeah.
bombardment, running with your
Yeah.
kids, and there's explosions above your head, that's for me as good a definition
Okay.
as a war. When 30 citizens are killed and 1,000 are injured, and there's devastation in the city that you live in. Yeah, it's a war within a war. A small war with a different impact that in a bigger war that's gone on for 20 months, whose impact is very different. The war, obviously, on Gaza.
Yeah, and nothing has finished here, really, has it? They'll retrench if they do develop their nuclear capability from a war point of view. I presume they're going to do that very carefully and hide it a little bit better than what they've been doing before.
That's a very reasonable, interpretation, and many people are saying that it sets it back by a limited time, but it increased the motivation for them to get one, to get a bomb, or a dirty bomb, or a version of a bomb. Yes, there is a possibility that maybe the priorities of the regime might shift, and that the economy is under stress, the population is growing fast, survival of the regime is important. Maybe there'd be, who knows, investments elsewhere. And who knows if that war with Israel is over even in the short term, because my 8-year-old asked me, is the war over? And I said, yeah. And she said, but isn't it just Afsaka Ash, which is a ceasefire in Hebrew? And I was thinking, she has the language of war. And I thought, well, yeah, but I believe the war is over. She said, so is the war over in Gaza? And I said, no. And then you're caught, it's an 8-year-old and you're caught. And I said, there's these many people in tents, and they don't have homes, and they don't have enough food. And she paused and said, well, maybe we could take some of the children. There's space in my bedroom for one child. Maybe I'll go and ask the children, like my schoolmates. I go to school and ask them to ask their parents. And, your head is spinning. Your gut is like, wow, this is how she's thinking. And it's like sad, and it's beautiful for her to say that. And she doesn't know, obviously, the horror that's been unleashed in Gaza. And then part of my brain is thinking, oh, Jesus, no, don't go telling the kids in school and asking the parents, could they take a Palestinian child? What the impact would be on her if parents, said, I don't want my kid to be listening to your politics, etc.
The truth of it is she's, in all likelihood, hearing a very different conversation within your four walls than what her classmates are hearing. And that would put her in a very innocent, awkward spot with her pals, wouldn't it, in school, I'm guessing?
At the age of 8, I don't think so, unless she brings it up, because I believe at that age they're not seeking out too much information or talking about it other than the reality of schools closed and there's booms and bombs. But very quickly, 12, 14, there would be deeply politicized conversations among that age group, informed by what they hear from their parents, what they see on the news, what they hear from the school. So, if we do stay, you have that ahead of you as to how you navigate the different stories around them as children and what they learn from home.
We know what going to school in Ireland was like. And if you go to America, where all of the kids now were, they have the gun drills just in case there's a shooter in the school. They do things like that on a regular basis. And I can imagine how that would affect a young child. But in your case, your 8-year-old and your 3-year-old have now been through this whole cycle of bomb shelters and sirens and all that kind of thing. Have you seen this changing her, do you think?
Again, it's such a difficult question to answer. On one level, you assume it must have an impact, particularly on the 8-year-old, in terms of her thinking. And yet, their resilience at, very different ages, 3 and 8, their resilience to the sounds and the drama of the sounds and 2 minutes after it's all over is extraordinary. But you don't know what's going through their head, obviously, and what's going deep inside them in terms of their thoughts. You have to exercise incredible, careful judgment about when and how you talk about it and what you say. The 3-year-old obviously is clueless, but she's had 2/3 of her life under silence. So she does jump a little bit if there's a car alarm goes off, or there's an ambulance, or there's a bus puts on its brakes, and she says the word silent. It has to. It has to.
Absolutely. I know in my case, Paul, I separated when I was 28 and the kids were 6 and 3, and you have conversations about all of that stuff. And if it ever comes up about separation affecting the kids, a lot of time people will say stuff back to you, well, kids, to use your word, are very resilient. And from my experience and been through that and witnessing, some of the effects of that down the road, I would always say back, don't confuse resilience with their lack of ability to communicate what's going on, exactly what they're saying. And I do think they process things in their own way, and they don't have the skill set about really explain to you or whoever else about how they're feeling. So resilience is probably, you just get up the following day and you play with your pals and you go to school and you do whatever.
Absolutely. And the jump from normality to terror or fear to back to normality is quite sharp. But on resilience, I don't have the skill sets now to communicate to them what this means or what's appropriate for their age. You're guessing in your head, and you may look up stuff, but it's not an easy thing to look up as to how to tell your 8-year-old, but a missile hitting a building 100 meters away. What information do you give? How do you explain the noise, etc.? I remember at the very beginning, 2 years ago, I asked some friends as the sirens were coming in from Gaza, and I asked, and she was 6, and I asked parents, what were they telling their kids? And these are left liberal Tel Avivians, left-leaning Tel Avivians, and they said, we tell them there's good missiles and there's bad missiles, and the bad missiles are coming in. And I thought, well, I'm not fucking saying that. I'm not going into good missiles and bad missiles, but
wow.
And it's interesting. Having said that, I haven't asked. And I must not be asking for a reason. I haven't asked friends what they tell their children. Perhaps I don't want to know.
Yeah. And Gaza, at this point in time, I would say the noise about it is still as high here as it has been. I think they're still pushing very, very hard on things like sanctions and the International Criminal Court. I would say all of those conversations are still going on. I think the government have been on the front foot, despite a lot of people politicising it, as we said the last day, and criticise them for not being proactive enough. But in Israel, where is Gaza now? Or is it just wallpaper? And I know you've kind of said that already in our conversation. But what's going on? What do you see happening?
Well, where is it, and what do I see happening? Where is it? It's shockingly invisible. In terms of the news. As I said, the main kind of paper of record, Haaretz, which is left-leaning, has incredible, powerful stories. Just recently had, an in-depth story of they chose 28 kids that were killed from the age of, some were killed on the day they were born, and there's hundreds who were killed in the first days of their birth, to like 12-year-old kids, and they had, everybody's on a video at some point. So they had videos. They had little videos of these kids at different birthday events, and it was powerful. It's something I haven't even seen in The Guardian or the New York Times. And that's Haaretz. But the news channels, you might as well be on a different planet, a different world. And my ire or frustration, and it's probably more ire, is now about the role that the mainstream television channels are playing in censoring, hiding, avoiding, showing the reality of what's in Gaza. Because I'm firmly of the opinion that the average Israeli at home saw what the rest of the world sees, it would change their view. And I think their culpability, and I don't think that's too strong a word, I think their culpability of these, media stars, we all have them in every country, high-paid media stars, and whatever reason to partake in not showing what's happening will not be forgotten for decades. And I think it's one of the biggest stories of the war that the outside world just can't grasp. And inside of Israel, they don't know. It's not that they don't know what the horror of Gaza. It's just not part of the mainstream frame to sit down every evening, watch the news, and see the horror that you see. It just blows people's minds out of Israel why this is not shown, and how it's not shown, and it blows people's minds. How do people not know, or what do they know? What do they not find out? Why do they don't find out? And it's depressing watching the Israeli news. Utterly depressing. As to what will happen, again, it's a game of speculation, but the politics of it is the expectation that if something positive happens, that the government will collapse because the very far right in Netanyahu's government want nothing but ethnic cleansing and recolonization of Gaza. 80-90% of Israelis don't want that, but that's the reality of what's actually happening. And if he signals some medium-term solution that involves the Palestinian Authority and overseas agencies becoming involved in food distribution, or even overseas peace force, etc., his government will fall. I think most Israelis would welcome that. They'd welcome both, actually. They'd want the government to fall, and they'd welcome, obviously, an end to the war for a variety of reasons. And Europe seems incapable, dare I say it, of influencing it. And America at the moment seems unwilling to put sufficient pressure. And I don't know where the pressure can come from. Perhaps ultimately it has to be the responsibility of Israelis to understand what's been done in their name.
That relationship between America and Europe is an economic one at the moment, with all the tariffs and everything else. So I think people are afraid to pick a fight about anything else because it'll damage you economically. So it's money that's ruling the roost there. When you talk about media and how it's been bent in a particular way in Israel, I was on the radio this week commenting on a post that Donald Trump put out. So if we accept that really nullifying the Iranian nuclear capability, if we accept that that's a really important thing, and we accept that they were pretty close to having nuclear weapons, then it's a fair thing to inquire as to how successful the bombings were, and to establish clearly whether they did the job that we thought they did do or they didn't. So Trump, obviously, with his chest out as usual, was declaring the whole thing a huge success before I think a ceasefire was even agreed between the different parties. Trying to bully the rhetoric into a case of, well, their nuclear capability was totally obliterated. Now, the fact that it's obliterated is really important. If you think there's a huge threat, to know it's obliterated is good. But you do want facts around all of that. And of course, the different media organizations trying to establish that fact because it's so important. He's been biting at all of them because they're literally doing their jobs, and trying to investigate that particular thing. So he put out some really, really shocking posts. There was one against a CNN reporter because I think she was investigating it, saying, well, maybe the nuclear capability wasn't fully obliterated. And because he didn't like that train of thought or that train of argument or the fact that journalists were questioning this in any way, she should be fired immediately from CNN and thrown out like a dog. This is the American president. And I thought a few things. One, he wants to shut down the media in the States, so they're going to get punished if they express any version of the story that he doesn't want to put out there, even though it's very important that we get to the truth. And that particular journalist as well as being cross with CNN, there's no shadow of a doubt she's going to be attacked online by all of the MAGA nutjobs. And there's a good chance her own life will be under threat, physically in the normal course of her work and her life. So what you're saying about the media in Israel, I think, is happening in a very, very real way in other parts of the world as well. Are Israelis, Paul, are they leaving? Are there conversations about this is not a safe place to live anymore and we need to get out of here?
Yes. There's conversations, I think, on that subject daily. And I think I have them hourly.
Yeah.
And it's very common. In some sections of society, not. It's usually the more middle class or secular, obviously those who have two passports, Tel Avivian. But they are leaving. Last year, the Central Bureau of Statistics said, I think it was 90,000, which is 1% of the population. That's no mean thing just to leave in 1 year. They believe are not coming back. And it's usually, as I say, highly skilled, tech, with skills to offer abroad, effectively, and English language skills. So there is conversations. I know personal people who have left. So it's there. And then yet there's another weird thing about Israel. Israel, they say, and I saw this in the news, Israel is the only war zone in the world where people have tried to come back as quickly as possible while it's at war, to come back to their country rather than, leave. So there were tens of thousands of Israelis stranded abroad as tourists, but they were trying to get back as quick as they could. And it wasn't just that there was, family here, obviously there was, but because many of them would have been away with their immediate family, with their kids. And they wanted to get back to a war zone. They want to get back to this little tiny country that, they feel is under attack. So that the sense of loyalty to the state, the sense, the Jewish state is their only space which they will feel safe. And there was fear of terrorism abroad and Israeli targets abroad and Israeli tourists abroad and embassies abroad. So there was a strange desire to get back as much as possible with conversations about people leaving. I think people will continue to leave. It depends really what happens, including, I think, the results of the next election. I think it's going to be important. They have to take place by the end of next year. And at the moment, if there was an election, Netanyahu and the far right would lose. There's no great hope coming in, but it would be a government to the left of the current government, probably a broad spectrum of government, including Arab parties, which actually formed the previous coalition, which is a very positive thing. So that taboo has been broken, that Arab parties are part of a formal coalition. So the opposition from the left to the centre right to the secular right to whatever would likely win. If they fail to win, I think is possibly the last election that the centre, people abroad would call it another right-wing government, but the centre-left may win an election because there's a demographic thing. I think I've spoken to before that the population growth with the Haredim is so substantial that the tipping point will come soon where a non-religious right-wing government will just not be able to be formed. So that's a big date, and I think the relief in the country will across 60% of the country. If the government doesn't win and Netanyahu is possibly kept out of power, even though he's 6 or something, for 4 years will be a key moment, I think, in the direction of the country. Because conversations, hopefully we won't be waiting a year for solutions to Gaza. But it's been 2 years almost now. But positive conversations, hopeful conversations can take place, meaningful hopeful conversations can take place if they lose that election.
And you know my next question, don't you?
So there's two. First of all, are you happy? And second, why the hell are you still there?
Yeah, there you go. I'll leave them both with you. Come on.
The happy one is just such a complex word in the context of what's happening and the guilt all the time, the guilt that you feel of, and they're connected, obviously. Why am I keeping the children here? Why am I putting through this? And then the guilt of, a simple pleasure like going for a swim in the sea, juggling that with the reality of, war crimes and genocide 70 kilometers down the road and the imagery that you see and have to see. I have to see that every day. I can choose not to, but you have to see it. And how do you define happiness in those moments? But you do grab them, and that's just life. And as I said before, being with the children and just playing with them are the moments, that you grab. It's not virtue signaling by saying you're aware that this is something that tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza have lost. I continue to lose daily. So it's an extraordinarily emotional roller coaster every day as to what's normal, what's happy, what's guilty, and grabbing moments. And the bigger picture is always there. Do you stay? How do we go? Under what circumstances? And the 8-year-old wants to go to Ireland. As I said before, she's been there 8 times, and she wants to go.
Yeah, and to you, Paul, at this stage, taking everything into account, there's water here, you can swim here. It's probably a little bit colder. I guarantee it is. Being very realistic, should you be getting out of there at this stage?
Well, I did some radio interviews during the 12 days, and people were leaving. Irish people were leaving. Many people were trying to get out. The airport was closed, and anyway, it was across the border to Jordan, and they did ask, and we didn't have any plans at that point to try and get out while the war was on. For a variety of logistical reasons, it was unsafe, and as the airport is closed. Now, in the short term, the airport has opened up, but flights are limited and expensive. But the only, I think, big decision is, do we leave for good? And that is a decision that to put in place. You're thinking like a 6 months, a year kind of plan. Even thinking like that's potentially crazy. You don't know what's ahead of you. You don't know what's ahead in 2 weeks. So the idea that you have the luxury of an Israeli in Tel Aviv as an Irish citizen, an Israeli citizen, deciding we leave in June 2026 because it suits us, it's foolish. It's in many ways it's foolish, but part of your brain is very logical, and you're thinking of all sorts of things: jobs, money, property, rent, schooling, language. And the other is saying, it only takes one horrific incident and your whole world is destroyed, or you just don't know.
It sounds like you've got, I won't say the luxury, but you could be in control of that choice at the moment, couldn't you?
Absolutely, and I'm aware of that luxury.
Yeah.
No decision under a level of stress to re-emigrate or leave with kids is an easy one, but in the context not only of obviously the reality in Gaza about being trapped, but for most Israelis or many other Israelis who don't have 2 passports or may not have the financial wherewithal or just the experience or family connection. I mean, I'm Irish. To settle in Ireland is nothing for me. So yeah, it is a luxury, and you play with that luxury in your head as to what's best and what's appropriate. Needless to say, my family just think I'm nuts.
Your Irish family, I presume.
Yeah. And actually, some Israeli family also have said peculiar things to me, which is, I'll say, one very sweet, dear in-law. She said, "Why are you here? This isn't your war." And I thought it was an extraordinary thing to say, in the sense that my 2 kids who are Israelis, Israeli Jews, and they've been reared as Israeli Jews, were sitting around me playing, not listening. But that I was, despite being an Israeli citizen, despite having an Israeli partner, married to an Israeli, despite having 2 Israeli kids, despite living here for the last 8 years, somehow I was an outsider, sufficiently outside that it wasn't my war. And I felt there was something odd about that, because the rockets are falling. They're not distinguishing who's the best Zionist and who's an anti-Zionist. It was an extraordinary, and to kind of emotionally own the war, I thought was, and this was a liberal left person as well, and very international as well. I thought to kind of own it in that way was maybe a sign I shouldn't be here, because I don't think, however long I will be here, I won't be owning the war on behalf of the government. It's not my war. I can analyze it and justify an attack in Iran or criticize an attack in Iran, but I won't have that push. But then again, I wasn't born Jewish and I wasn't born Israeli, so
And you didn't have to serve in the Israeli army for a couple of years or whatever either. So in some way, in that comment, was there a little bit of, you're not one of us? Was there a tiny bit of that in that comment, do you think?
I felt that.
Okay, yeah.
I felt that, and I shared the comment with a few friends and family. I just asked what did they think, and it was very interesting. The responses came back. They were varied, but there was a bit. You're not one of us. And then somebody said, well, maybe it was a kind of a projecting. They couldn't leave, and you could. So why are you here? And it was something more simple or generous, but I just had the phrase, it's not your war, it's our war, was an interesting one. I won't send her this podcast.
Yeah, I was going to say, bring her on the podcast and we'll discuss it, Paul. Thank you so much. In a win-happy context, it's very, very easy to feel totally and utterly despondent in 2025 when the stuff is going on in Gaza. Would you use the word genocide?
I avoid the word when I'm writing about it because it polarizes, but okay. I think it's a completely fair comment. It's a completely fair term.
Yeah.
And it's been used by people in the center of Israeli politics and ex-prime ministers. But it can shut down conversations very quickly, but I have no problem with that word.
Yeah, okay. And it goes beyond Gaza. We see the world in a bit of a shambles and our lack of ability to sort it out. The International Criminal Court, all of these devices and institutions that are in place to stop all of this stuff happening. It feels like, as individuals, we're totally powerless at this stage. Do you believe that to be true? Is there room for us as individuals to make a difference and have a little bit of hope in the middle of all this, like having these conversations, I guess?
You know, absolutely. It's a big question, but absolutely. And, you know, it depends where you are. And conversations are important. And I think maybe one of the biggest contributions I can make, I mean, I do write about what's happening and, you know, communicate what's happening. But in some ways, maybe a bigger contribution is having conversations with people around me, being braver, being, you know, to try and get people to talk about the reality of what's happening there. We all have a different role in different places, but in relation to Israel, Israel has a huge tradition of demonstrations. You know, they're on the street for something or other constantly. And you know, when the war finished, the 12-day war with Iran finished this Saturday, there was tens of thousands on the streets again, calling for an end to the war with Gaza. As I said, they may be calling for an end to the war with Gaza because of the impact on Israeli armed services or hostages, but there's a growing street presence of those who recognize what's happening in Gaza. And there's a small section of the demonstration that is shown considerable respect. I mean, it's a quiet part of the demonstration where they hold up the pictures of killed Palestinian children. And it's very moving to see, you know, a line of people in silence with candles and dozens of pictures of dead Palestinian children. And quite brave. And, you know, maybe for Irish listeners, it's shocking to think that's brave when you can go on the streets or do go on the streets constantly and demonstrate against what's happening in Gaza. But in the context of this moment in Israeli consciousness or history or awareness, they are brave. They are brave. And it's being picked up and there's conversations around that. And as I said, Haaretz is an incredible service to the state and to the world and what it tells and what it shows, the Israeli mainstream center-left newspaper. We all have a role. We have to recognize, you know, what part or what role we have. I'm just still amazed by the prime journalists who come on every night. And I know their salaries are high and they could walk away from all this if they articulated an opinion that says, I can't do this anymore. I have a responsibility as a journalist. And they choose not to. And so we all have to look in the mirror and think, what can you say? What can you do? How can you communicate? And as I said before, we all have different responsibilities, from being an anchor in a television studio in Tel Aviv and sitting in West Cork.
Paul, thank you so much. I think your presence there is really important. And that role you have with your voice and your curiosity and your determination to talk about the things that no one wants to talk about there. You're playing a colossal role. And while it would be selfish of me to say you need to get out of there as quick as you can, it does feel like you're doing something really, really important there. So until we chat again, please be really, really safe. Mind those two beautiful girls and your partner and yourself, of course. And I'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Greg, for those very kind words at the end. I really appreciate it. I really do. And I will. And hopefully it'll be a bit sunnier in West Cork.
Not looking likely today. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.